so now we are going to move on to the phylum Chordata. So within this phylum, we're going to discuss two subphyla of invertebrate chordates, which are the Urochordata. These are also known as the tunicates and salps. And then the subphylum Cephalochordata, which are the lancelets. And then, of course, also within phylum Chordata is the subphylum we belong to, the Vertebrata. However, we are not invertebrates, and so we're not really going to talk about us very much. Also within the Urochordata, we're going to talk about three classes: the Acidiacea, the Thaliacea, and the Appendicularia. So we'll talk about what each one of those is. All right, so our kind of roadmap for the course again. Let me turn on my little laser pointer. All right, so in our little roadmap, we are here with the chordata, which of course is within the deuterostomia. Now you guys know all about what deuterostomia means. It's referring to our deuterostomous development. And then you can kind of see how we are related to the other animal phyla. But we're going to kind of start up here. So we are here in just list form in the Deuterostomia phylum Chordata. Within the or Chordata is within the Deuterostomia. So I want to talk a little bit about this deeper deuterostomia branch a little bit, and who sort of our relatives are that belong in this group that we are also going to talk about over the next few days and weeks of the class. All right, so if we zoom in on just the deuterostomia branch, we've got basically the chordata divided into our three subphyla. And then we've also got this other branch with these six sister clades, Hemichordata and Echinodermata. And these two phyla, so these are two separate phyla, we group them together because they are closely related. And this entire branch that includes both of them, or this entire clade, is called the Amblycraria. All right. So today we are going to be talking about chordata and also probably finishing up the chordata lecture and then moving into the hemichordata in the next class. So chordates have certain characteristics during their lives. And it's important to realize that chordates only have to possess each of these characteristics at some point during their lives. So a lot of chordates that you're most familiar with, the vertebrates, are only going to have these characteristics during their embryonic, later embryonic stages or during their larval stages. And we usually lose them in adults. So does anybody want to name, or does anybody know any of those chordate characteristics? Just one. Does anybody know any of them?
I could be wrong on this, but my only guess, don't they need like a spinal cord? Isn't that what like they are? Yeah, they just said notochord, like the
Yeah, so a spinal cord, what you're thinking about when you think about the spinal cord, you've got that, there's two components of that, right? So you've got a nerve cord, and then you've got a structure which in invertebrates is the spine that is supporting that nerve cord and also an important site for muscle attachment. So, yeah, so Sophia mentioned notochord and Parker mentioned the dorsal hollow nerve cord. So, the dorsal hollow nerve cord is basically your actual spinal cord, right? And in the chordates, that spinal cord is going to be dorsal and hollow. So those two words are important to include, not just nerve cord, because other phyla of invertebrates do have a nerve cord. It's just going to be solid and or ventral instead of dorsal. So dorsal hollow nerve cord. And then the notochord is sort of the proto spine, essentially. So it is a structure that supports that dorsal hollow nerve cord and also is going to provide a structure for muscles to attach to. And we see that in embryonic chordates of all kinds, and in at least one group of chordates, well, a couple groups of chordates actually, as adults too. All right, so good. So that's two of them. So let's talk, oops. Oh, wait. Oh, okay. What did I have? Oh, maybe I don't have that. Oh, where'd it go? Yeah, my slide is not showing everything for some reason. I don't know what's really going on with that. Let me go out of this for just a second. I don't know what it's doing. Try to end my show. All right, can you guys see my PowerPoint without the animation now? Okay, hopefully you can. Because I think I shared screen too. So yeah, so your chordates are going to have that dorsal hollow nerve cord. They're going to have that dorsal notochord. And then there's some other characteristics too. So pharyngeal gill slits. You guys might have heard that one before sometime in the past. Does that jog your memory? So yeah, the pharyngeal gill slits are just going to mean that there's some kind of slits that may or may not lead to some kind of respiratory structures that are located in the pharynx, which is just your throat, right? So pharyngeal gill slits, a post-anal tail. So there's just some kind of tail structure, which is going to have musculature and a vertebral elements and nerve cord slash continuation of the notochord beyond the anus at some stage in development. So all of us had a tail when we were embryos. And then the other one that actually doesn't get covered very often is that we have some kind of gland in the pharynx region. Again, that's the throat that produces or processes iodine. And in some of our invertebrate chordates, the cephalochordata and the urochordata that we're going to talk about, urochordata is also called tunicata, that takes the form of the endostyle, which actually produces mucus that they use for filter feeding. So we'll talk more about that in detail in a minute. And in the vertebrata, this same homologous structure actually becomes your thyroid gland, which is a really important hormonal structure. So that's kind of interesting. All right, let me go back into slideshow mode. No, I don't know why everything goes away. But anyway, if we map those characteristics onto the phylogeny of Deuterostomia, you can see when they originated. So we share the pharyngeal gill slits. Let me go back to my little laser pointer. Another thing I like to do is to zoom in here. Okay, so we share the pharyngeal gill slits and also some other characteristics with the ambulocrania, which are the echinodermata and the hemichordata. And then zoom in again. Just the chordata, including all three of the subphyla, do have the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the muscular postanal tail, and the endostyle. And then there's some other characteristics that we'll talk about when we talk about each of the subphyla. All right. Yeah. Okay, so these chordate characteristics, as I said, are seen in each subphylum at some stage in development. So the cephalochordata, they're the only ones that retain all, well, they're the only whole subphylum, I should say, that retain all of these chordate characteristics as adults, including pharyngeal gill slits, a notochord, and a postanal tail. All cephalochordates do have all of those as adults. And then we get into the urochordates or the tunicates or sea squirts, and salps. Most of them, not all, but the majority of the groups of them, they lose all of those characteristics except for the pharyngeal gill slits and then also the endostyle as adults, when they undergo metamorphosis. And they go from being these swimming larvae with a notochord and a dorsal hollow nerve cord and a postanal tail. They go from being these swimming things to these sessile bags of basically feeding organism as adults. And then, of course, the vertebrata, as you guys are familiar with, many but not all of us lose our pharyngeal gill slits during later stages of development. Our notochord is going to develop into components of the spine or vertebral column, and then that dorsal hollow nerve cord is going to remain in adults. And of course, we do have a thyroid gland as adults as well. And many, but not all, of the vertebrates lose our muscular postanal tail. Okay, but we all have all those things at some stage of development. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different subphyla of chordata. So sub just means under. So a subphylum is just a clade that's underneath of a phylum, but it's not small enough yet to be considered a class. Okay. All right. So the urochordata, which sometimes you'll see them called tunicata, those are equivalent terms. And sometimes you'll also hear people, including me, use the common name tunicate to refer to all of the Urochordata. So the Urochordata is the sister group of the Vertebrata. So they are the most closely related to us of all the chordates. So if we go back here, you can kind of see that. So here are the vertebrates. So this clade here is including all of the Vertebrata subphylum. And then we've got the Urochordata subphylum here. So that's all these guys. Okay. So yeah, subphyla-wise, Urochordata is the sister clade to the Vertebrata. Okay, so all of our chordates, including our tunicates, are going to be triploblastic and bilaterally symmetrical. The adult stage of a tunicate gets its name from this structure called a tunic, which is an outer body covering that in a lot of them is very protective and can be really thick. Some of you guys have already had lab yesterday, right? So you've dissected a tunicate and you have seen firsthand how tough that tunic can be, right? Are any of you guys who are here in the Tuesday lab? Anybody? No? All right. Anyway, if you're not in Tuesday lab, you'll see late this afternoon or later this week that the tunic can be really tough. And the reason that it's really tough is because it actually contains a lot of cellulose. Um, Cellulose is the fiber that makes wood, right? So this is super weird for an animal to have cellulose. Um, this is a carbohydrate, a very complex carbohydrate that is structural in plants, including trees, that makes wood. And all those fibers in your celery, all of that's because of the cellulose that makes up a large portion of cell walls in plants. And so it's super weird that the tunic contains cellulose. There are no other animals with cellulose. And it is thought that the genes for producing this cellulose actually arose from horizontal gene transfer from some symbiotic bacteria. So yeah, so that's super weird, right? So if you haven't heard of horizontal gene transfer, that's basically where organisms get genes that don't just come from their parents, right? So this is not gene transfer because of phylogeny or your evolutionary relationships with, your ancestors, but rather genes that cells acquired at some point from other organisms or from their environment. And horizontal gene transfer has happened. Actually, we're learning more and more about how often that has occurred and is responsible for a lot of our characteristics. Anyway, did you guys know like 8% of your genome actually originated from viruses? Yep. So that's also horizontal gene transfer. Anyhow, so how did tunicates get cellulose? Probably horizontal gene transfer, not from their ancient relatives. So they also retain and enlarge actually their pharyngeal gill slits as adults. And those pharyngeal gill slits form this basket-like structure that I'm going to show you in more detail in a minute, that is coated in mucus produced by the endostyle, and used for suspension feeding. Tunicates have oral and atrial siphons. So the oral siphon is the one that they pull water into their bodies with. And the atrial siphon is the one that the water goes out of their body with. So the oral siphon is close to where their esophagus starts inside of this tunic. So on this nice clear guy, you can sort of see the gut. That's what this yellow bit is. So the organism's kind of mouth is right here. So this will be the oral siphon, and then it's going to actually go into this enlarged, and you can't really see it here because it's a clear structure, but it's going to go into this entire basket that's an enlarged pharynx. It's going to get the food out of that, wrap it all up, and deposit it into the esophagus. And then it has a whole little digestive system in here, and ending in an anus. And then the poo goes out with the excess water through that atrial siphon. Their larvae do have the notochord and nerve cord. The larvae are called tadpole larvae because they literally look like little tadpoles. So I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. But they do lose both of these, including their dorsal hollow nerve cord as adults. They do have a little bit of kind of a nerve net that keeps things running, but not really a dorsal hollow nerve cord anymore as adults. Okay, so we are going to learn about 3 different classes of tunicates. So, class Acidiacea are the sea squirts. And if you guys have ever seen any kind of urochordate, you've probably seen a sea squirt. So have any of you guys who are here ever seen a sea squirt before? And I apologize, my husband made biscuits, so I'm eating one. Nope, nobody's ever seen a tunicate or an ascidian, a sea squirt. So the sea squirts are benthic. So they live on the bottom. They metamorphose, and I'll show you their larvae in just a moment, but they metamorphose into these adults that attach to the substrate on the bottom. That is what benthic means, basically. Many ascidians are solitary. So there's just a single animal that lives by itself. They can also be colonial, where you have an individual that buds asexually into multiple individuals. And they can be connected in different ways, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And you'll also see in a lot of detail on lab. But I'll also point out that solitary forms may be gregarious. So gregarious is the same thing it means in people. When you have a gregarious personality, it means you're social, right? So the gregarious or social sea squirts, they like to settle close to each other, right? But they are genetically distinct individuals, rather than reproducing by cloning. This group Acidiacea is not technically a monophyletic group, but we're still going to use this as a functional grouping to talk about the benthic tunicates. All right. The class Thaliacea are the salps, and you may have heard of them before in terms of carbon capture. So these guys and also the Appendicularia are both pelagic and they tend to live out in the open ocean and they can be super common. So you can have areas where they're just like on top of each other and there's just like tons of them. Way out in the open ocean, that's why most people aren't super familiar with them. We don't see them very often, but they are really, really common. And they're important in global carbon capture and this carbon pump that really takes carbon from the water surface and therefore from the atmosphere and deposits it ultimately in the deep sea. So in terms of the salps, they kind of live fast and die young. And like I said, their populations can be incredibly dense in some places. They form these really long chains of clonal individuals, so colonies. There are some species that are solitary of salps also. And when they are filter feeding from the environment, so they're eating a lot of phytoplankton and also zooplankton that are taking in a lot of carbon dioxide. Um, and then they will die in pretty large numbers, and because they live over the open ocean, their dead bodies float down and become a component of marine snow in the deep sea, serving as a major food source down there and also taking that carbon from the surface and making it end up in the form of their own dead bodies as well as their fecal pellets in the deep sea where that carbon will stay for millennia, basically. So very, very important organisms. Um, these guys actually are derived from ascidians. So phylogenetically, the Thaliacea are actually nested among the Ascidiacea, which is why Ascidiacea is actually a polyphyletic group, or sorry, a paraphyletic group. Okay. So the Appendicularia, so these guys are weird. The other name for them is larvaceans. And the reason they're called larvaceans is because they actually stay in essentially their larval form as adults. Um, so they have this adult stage and they do change a little bit. So they do metamorphose between their juvenile and adult stage. But the adult looks a lot like the tadpole larva of these other tunicates. But the thing is that as adults, they produce these gigantic mucus houses, and it's called a house. I didn't make that up. It should just be called like a filter, but it doesn't only filter, so I don't know. I guess house is the right word for it. But they actually secrete mucus on the outside of their bodies, and the thing can be huge. I'm going to show you pictures, but the thing can be huge compared to the actual living organism. And it has all this complicated structuring for filter feeding. But they make this mucus house. And they essentially wag their little muscular tail inside of there to generate a water current. Um, and then they will discard those houses whenever their filters get clogged up. And so an individual appendicularian can discard multiple mucus houses every day. And mucus is actually mostly polysaccharides, sugars, which is mostly carbon. So again, these things are taking a lot of carbon from close to the surface of the ocean where they're living and feeding. And then when they discard it over deep water, it's going to become part of the marine snow, just like the fecal pellets and dead bodies of the Thaliaceans. So both of these two classes of tunicates are super important in reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So very important. All right, so I mentioned that the Acidiacea class is not considered monophyletic. So if you look at sort of the color coding on the four clades here, which are four monophyletic clades, you'll see that one of those monophyletic clades and all of, well, I'll get into it in a second. One of those clades is the Thalliaceae. So the Thalliaceae, again, are the salps. And these other three clades, you don't have to know the names of them. These other three clades here are all benthic organisms that we would call ascidians. Okay, so Acidiacea includes these three guys. So it's polyphyletic because we're including these ancestors and their descendants, but not all their descendants. Thalliaceae would be one of the descendants. And so anyway, so Acidiacea is not a monophyletic group. Thalliaceae, though, is a monophyletic group. It's just within the Acidiacea. And then Appendicularia, these little guys with the mucus houses, they are also a monophyletic group. Okay. All right, so let's talk in detail about each of these classes. So the Acidiacea, or the sea squirts, these are our most familiar ones. This is the only kind of Urochordate I have actually personally seen in the wild. I haven't gotten lucky enough to see any salps while scuba diving or anything like that. Sometimes once in a while people see them. Anyhow, so these sea squirts are sessile and benthic as adults, and they have these tadpole larvae that are pretty short-lived, and that doesn't mean they die. It just means that they don't exist in that form of life for very long compared to their adult stage. So as we said, they can be solitary or colonial. The colonial ones can be social or compound, and we'll talk more about what that means. And then the colonies, for those that are colonial, actually form, as we said, from asexual reproduction. The original individual for the colony, though, does arise from a larva that was the result of sexual reproduction. So all of these guys are hermaphrodites. So they have male and female parts, so testes and ovaries within every individual. Because there's only one sex, even though each individual kind of has two sexes, there's only one sex of individual. That's also called monoecious. You've heard that term? A lot of these guys, they produce some nasty toxic chemicals, and a cool thing about them is that a lot of times those toxic chemicals actually come from their ability to retain toxic heavy metals from their environment, which is super weird. Somehow they don't hurt the Ascidian, but they can be super toxic to anything that eats them. And they produce some other secondary metabolites that taste bad and are toxic as well. So they're chemically defended, and they have this aposematic coloration that kind of warns potential predators like, hey, I am dangerous. You do not want to eat me. So that's part of how they protect themselves. Um, as I said, that those cellulose genes are thought to have arisen through horizontal gene transfer from symbiotic bacteria. And there are some living tropical species that do have photosynthetic cyanobacteria symbionts living within their bodies. So that's kind of cool. There's also some super weird deep sea predatory species. Like, look at this thing here in K. This is like a sea squirt with a giant mouth that like engulfs things. So super, super weird, very derived condition that we don't commonly see in our sea squirts in shallow water. So only fairly recently discovered. Um, I am gonna skip this video for right now because we only have 2 more minutes in class, so we'll probably start with that next time. But just to kind of finish up discussing how these guys work as adults, as we said, they are a type of suspension feeder called filter feeders. That just means that they actually take the water inside of their bodies to filter out the food products that they want from the water. And so they're going to draw their water in through an oral siphon. Usually the oral siphon is kind of like on the top, if you can tell where the top is on at least a solitary ascidian. So water's going to go in through that oral siphon. It is going to go into this really enlarged pharynx, which again is basically the throat. And it's really big and has these holes in it, which are the pharyngeal gill slits. And so because it's this big thing with these holes that filter stuff out, it's referred to as a pharyngeal basket. The holes that the excess water comes out of after the food is caught in the mucus that lines it are called stigmata. And as I said, this is lined with mucus that's able to sort of capture the food. That mucus is actually produced by the endostyle, which, as I said earlier, is homologous to our thyroid gland. So the endostyle produces the mucus, and that catches the food, and then so water goes in through that oral siphon. Food particles get trapped. The water actually escapes through the stigmata, and then it'll go out the atrial siphon and take with it any waste products from that digestive system. Okay. And this is just another schematic that sort of shows from the side in a little bit more detail some of the body structures. So we will go into the detailed anatomy of our ascidians in the next class. So we're going to go ahead and end for today, but